Today I'm going to be talking about labels, part 2. I did a video on labels a couple months ago and I've had some questions, and so if you're new to quilting, you may not really understand why labels are so important and how you can make labels. So this is labels part 2. Why do we need a label? It's because labels will tell the people that are around when you're not all about your quilt. So it's really necessary that you add a label to every quilt that you make. So 100 years from now, when you're not around, someone else will know that you made that quilt and when you made it. It's also important because it adds historical value to your quilt, or what they call it establishes provenance. So if sometime in the future your great-grands, different people that you know want to put that quilt in a museum or want to have it shown somewhere, this label will help give it historical value. Now then, if you saw my earlier video, I talked about different kinds of labels, and I'm going to go over them just really quickly. The first kind of, the easiest, fastest kind of quilt is to just write your information on the quilt. And this is what I often do when I'm in a hurry. This quilt is called Outhouse Symphony Movement Number 2. And here is the label on the back. Notice I put the name and I put my name and the date. Sometimes I actually write the name of the quilt, or write my name on the, let's see, this like this. Write my name on the quilt, somewhere on the front of the quilt. If artists can put their names on the front of their pictures, then quilters can put their names on the front of their quilts. And I just put C-lash and the date. So that's another option. I think in the earlier video I talked about using store-bought labels. You can buy a half-yard or a quarter-yard of labels that are already printed up. All you have to do is put the information on them. I cut this one out of this piece of fabric, and I don't know how old it is, but it's been around a while. When I sometimes use these labels, and when I began using them, I worried about writing neatly on the label. I didn't want my lines to go up go down. So what I would do is I put lines behind them. And the way I did that is I took a piece of freezer paper and I used a ruler and just drew lines across the paper in a dark black marker. And then I can take this paper and lay the fabric on top of it, press it with a dry iron, and you probably can't see, but I could see where my lines were. So I could put the title of the quilt, I could put the name of who made it, and etc. on those lines. Then I often use a computer to print my labels. If you have a computer and a printer, it's not difficult to do. I often will use that kind of label when I am making one of my flower hugs, because in the back of my flower hugs I have a label, either it says thinking of you, or I have a longer one that I also use that takes up a whole page. And I just take this from the printer, from the computer, and send it to the printer and print it on fabric. And when you're printing on fabric, you'll have to know how your printer works and all, but what I do is I take, again, a piece of freezer paper and I place it on the back of my fabric that I'm going to use for the label. I press it down and then cut the fabric right around the edge. And then I can put this piece of fabric, when it's backed with the freezer paper, through the printer, and it works a little bit better. So you know what your printer does, but that's what my printer does. I also, on the website under tutorials, have a tutorial about making these types of labels for my wall hugs. So look there. Now then, what should you put on your label? Oh, forgot one thing. I often use an extra block for a label. This is going to be on the back of this quilt, and I will probably put the information right in this little space because there's not too much clear space on this block. But I often use old blocks or blocks that I didn't put in the quilt as a label. Then, what should you put on your label? You can put whatever you want to put, but the important thing is that you have your name on it or whoever made the quilt. When you are writing your information on your label, I suggest that you use, first of all, a micron, or it doesn't have to be micron, I guess, but mine are micron, and they're archival ink. So make sure it has archival ink. I like to use 05 because it's a little thicker. 01 is very fine point. Sometimes I also use a Pentel gel marker for fabric. That works pretty well, and so I use one of those two pens. I put the maker's name on the quilt. If the quilt has a title or you've given it a name, put the name of the quilt on. If you had someone else quilt your quilt, if you took it to a long arm quilter, I always put their name on because they did a lot of the work. I put the date, or at least the year that the quilt was made. And it's also important, I think, if there's some interesting information about the quilt that you want to add. Is it a present for someone? Is it an anniversary, a baby gift? We did a quilt, I made a quilt years ago for my son, and it was sort of an African, we called it an African story quilt. My husband wrote the story that went with the quilt, and so we printed that off and put that on the back of the quilt. So the quilt information is important, and include as much as you would like. The main thing is that it's there, and it will be there whether you're there or not. The quilt will be continuing on after you. So I know quilters tend to be a little bit humble, and they don't like to be bragging about their work. But when you've put all that work and all that care and effort into a quilt, it surely needs a label on it. If this is your first quilt, make a label. If it's your last quilt, well, you never know, but it would be good to have a label on it. So hopefully this is all you need to know about labels.